I put the phone down and I thought, because Andy's one of my best buddies in the world, and I thought, I've just told one of my best mates that because of what I've said over the phone, he's going to be all right to go 240 miles an hour.
Road Scholars Live, fresh brewed and air-cooled deep tracks with Cam Ingram, Ray Schaefer, British car designer, Peter Stevens. Cam, I don't know about you, but the only music I've listened to the last couple of weeks has been our John Oates written theme song. It's just so cool.
It never gets tiring. It's such a good theme song. It's upbeat. It's reflective of our personalities. And what an honor to have John do that little jingle for our show. It's just awesome.
Very thankful for that. Thank you, John. Well, welcome, friends. Cam and I are two passionate Weissau enthusiasts whose work requires a daily deep dive into Porsche history and heritage. Cam is the owner of Road Scholars, multiple Concours winning restoration expert, author, and public speaker. I'm Ray Schaefer, former GM of Brumos Porsche, racer and speaker myself, now carrying the flag at Porsche Classic here in the US 8. And today we're driving down deep tracks of Porsche history with one of Britain's first formally trained automotive designers, talking about Professor Peter Stevens. Welcome to the conversation today, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's just really exciting because this has only come about over the last really week or so, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. It has. And it's interesting what a small world, how connected everything is. And, we went back to the first time we did this, and the conversation around Le Mans 98 led to a conversation with Stefan Ortelli, one of the co-drivers of the car, the winning car. And that led to Tony Hatter reaching out and saying, I have some experience around Le Mans 98 and that GT1 Porsche. And so we started talking there. And of course, our friend John Oates has a connection, it turns out, not only to Tony Hatter, but to you as well. And so, boy, Cam, we just keep having these things line up nicely, don't they?
I think we're really fortunate. It's been organic, and that's been the best part of the process. Is Professor Stevens is such a treat to get to speak with you and be with you today. But this organic connection from wonderful people and just watching the show, it's pretty special.
Okay, the deal is you're allowed to call me Peter, but you're not allowed to call me Pete.
Duly noted.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, would you mind, before we dive in a little bit on your background, I'm curious how that whole circle of friends between Tony Hatter and John Oates and Peter Stevens came to be.
Well, it's an interesting, and it's a kind of circle, that you suddenly discover this thing of all these people, I'm just looking, for example, over your shoulder, and I can see a Brumos Porsche there, and there's a link with that as well, which we may get into. But yeah, a very good friend of mine was a fellow called Richard Lloyd. I did, 100 years ago, I did a sponsorship deal for him. He was racing a Chevrolet Camaro in British touring cars,
wow.
Which was a car I loved. And I did a sponsorship deal with him via a magazine called Custom Car. And they said, we want to sponsor this thing, but we want the car to look great. I had been drawing the history of hot rods for Custom Car 120 years ago. And so the Camaro was owned by Richard Lloyd. We met up and we immediately just become the best of buddies, actually. Richard had been in the music business. Famously, he turned down, when he was a young A&R lad, he turned down the Beatles as a potential band, which we always took the mick out of him, because if ever there was a group you shouldn't turn down, it was the Beatles. But in amongst the music, he had come across Darrell Hall and John Oates when they had come to England, because he was still involved with record business a bit, And so I first met John there, took him down to what was the Kings Road Custom Car event, which we realized we all really liked car stuff. So it was way back then with John that I first met him. Stayed good friends in the way that you bob in and out of it. And then when we took our little 924 GTR to Daytona to do 24 hours, we stayed on to do, I think it was a 3-hour race at Daytona, and John shared the car with Richard, you know, and he was very handy in it, you know, because I thought, well, this is a rock and roll guy, you know, he's just going to go grinding around, but he was really on it. So that came about. But at the same time, as well as doing freelance, I was doing 2 days a week at Royal College of Art teaching in the vehicle design. And one of our students was Tony Hatter. And that was quite good fun because, I mean, Tony's very modest about it. He was pretty darn good. He was very, very nice at drawing. So we didn't have to struggle showing him which end of the pencil to sharpen and all that stuff, you know. But what I saw my task was of actually getting people to put on paper, not a nice drawing, but what they had in mind for a design. And Tony was very good at that. And as it happens, when he went off to, he mentioned on his piece, when he went off to Porsche, I sold him it was a cold rod. It wasn't a hot rod. It was a Peugeot 203 Familial. And I redid the body and I painted it, and the interior was trimmed, funnily enough, in brown corduroy, which looked really good with the kind of creamy color of the car. And Tony went off to, you know, to seek his fortune at Porsche in that car. You know, it just had this little 1300 engine. So I'd always intended, you know, to put something serious in it, but never did.
Peter, that's a great insight, Peter, about Tony's natural abilities. I'm a art student. I graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in sculpture. So I took many of a drawing class, and particularly design. It is very hard to translate what you have in your head to paper, and you can be a very technically gifted person. But I think if you're not an artist, it's hard to understand the transition of drawing what's in your head and in your mind as is design and translate it to paper. Can you go a little more into that? And that's fascinating.
Yes, it's interesting because it's the way that people draw, particularly in the auto industry, it looks like illustration, if you like, you know, in the terms of it. In other words, it looks like it would be a flat two-dimensional object. But of course, what you're representing is a three-dimensional object. And that is a very different discipline from drawing a nice, you know, whether it's a landscape or a nude model or anything else or a still life, you know, you're trying to capture in one drawing all 360 degrees of the object, you know. And I mean, in fact, one of the things that I would start with students, don't try and draw the whole car in your, and I say it to kids now, don't try and draw the whole car in your first view. Start with a side view so you get comfortable with where the wheels are relative to the rest of the shape and get the proportion right. And then you kind of sneak up on it and you turn the drawing, you know, in your mind a little bit. So you draw a bit of front end, so you've got a bit of windscreen, and you kind of gently approach doing a full 3D kind of sketch with it, you know. And that's, I mean, some people never really got that, you know, and particularly when it comes to ellipses, you know, and I mean, the whole point with a car, and when you're drawing it, so important that the car's relationship to the ground is what kind of tells you it's a car, you know, and the wheels there anchor it to the ground, if you like. So if the wheels aren't convincing, then the whole drawing falls to pieces, really. So I'm a stickler for getting the wheels right. And I still see people who don't get that, you know. So it's, I mean, of course, and the CAD doesn't really help you with this. All it does is a really sharp version of something awful. You know, I describe it, it's a box with sand and wires inside it. It doesn't have an idea in the computer at all, you know. You leave it there, come back the next day, it hasn't done anything except maybe something's not working so well. So which is why drawing for me is important. And when somebody, I mean, we had a few like Tony who would come along, Peter Horbury, who then became chief designer in Volvo and went to Ford and is now working for Geely. And he just drew beautifully, you know, and he still likes the business of drawing. You know, some of those people, unfortunately, they tortured themselves because it didn't come out right, and it's the language that we communicate in, it's the only way we do the communication, and people talk of all this fancy 3D stuff and virtual studios, and you put on the glasses and all this, and I worked with, this is going a long way off piece, but I worked with the people at Mahindra in India, introducing them to the modern, if you like, design method,
Mm-hmm.
and they had bought this thing with the goggles. And unfortunately, Alan Mahindra, who is the company, he's named on the front of all the vehicles, the moment he put the goggles on, he was sick because it just so disorientated him, and all these people who'd spent this fortune on this giant screen, and they couldn't show it to the boss because he just couldn't cope with the strangeness of the situation. You show him a drawing and he got immediately what you meant, and they were so disappointed. But but a nice drawing never disappoints.
Yes, that's universally true, is it not?
Well, I think it is, which is why I still like the illustration. And I sent you saw some illustration things that I did, and I still do. I kind of like that.
Yeah, I want to talk with you about that a little bit more. But you yourself you're the son of two artists yourself, right?
I am.
You probably never had a choice.
Well, I didn't. Yeah, because I mean, my father was very good. He was an extremely good painter, and my mother, she wasn't awed by that. She did really nice paintings, and there was no competition, and they weren't trying to outpaint each other or anything like that. But and in fact, I mean, they'd met at art school, before the Second World War, which was nice. And my dad, when he came back, and he realized, when he then had two sons, that he couldn't, as a painter, starving painters all very well, but if you've got a wife and two kids, you can't really be,
Mm-hmm.
So he became the curator of it was actually a furniture and design museum in the East End of London, which is the area where all kinds of furniture makers, going back to Hepplewhite and all these people, would have had, and there were still wonderful workshops there. So my Saturdays as a kid would be going along with my dad to the museum, and on Saturday mornings I was allowed into the rooms were like full-size diorama set piece. So I could sit in a 17th century dining room at the dining table and sketch stuff there,
Oh.
and I was just left to do it, or I could go back to 15th century or 1930s, which at the time, was probably the most modern thing they had in the museum. I think there was 1950s actually. And that was all, I didn't really like that stuff after. So that was a place called Jeffrey Museum, and that was good fun. But out of that as well came the other influence, which was that my mother's brother was a journalist called Dennis Jenkinson.
Mm-hmm.
And delightfully, the two Dennises, my father Dennis with two ends and my uncle Dennis with one end, they would travel together to Italy, particularly in the 356 Porsche. And my father would go and look at churches and museums and things. But normally on the Saturday night before a Grand Prix, they would find an opera to go to because they both loved to go to the opera. So they'd go to an opera together.
I love this.
And it's great because they would both send me postcards, of where they were. So there would be a postcard from Monza,
Oh, wow.
and then there would be a postcard from Milan from the opera house or a church or something my dad sent, and they were the two Dennises, and they just got on startlingly, delightfully well, and both of them were into guitar jazz as well, particularly a place called the Guitar Club and things like that. So it was a delightful upbringing, I would have to say. And there were two influences, and now of course I can easily say this.
Right.
There was my uncle with the engineering and the racing. There was my father with the art and design, and the obvious thing was I would bring those two things together, which to a degree was actually very true, because my uncle would come round with whatever. For example, he came round with the prototype of a Rover mid-engine V8, what was going to be a sports car.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this extraordinary thing, and Dennis would take me out in this, you know, and it was pretty darn quick, you know, and whatever car he had, he'd come round, because it was almost like he was deliberately trying to, you know, say to me, this is something exciting that you should do, you know. But
so was your uncle, I mean, he's one of my heroes. He transformed journalism. He's one of the early drivers that transitioned from being a race car driver, motorcycle enthusiast, you know, racer, into journalism. And he transformed journalism and wrote so many wonderful books. Was that palatable? I mean, he was trying to transform you to a car guy?
Well, he was tremendously articulate in all his conversation, but in a real cool, fun way. You know, I mean, when I was way younger, my dad was still in the army, and my mum she was actually one of the first people, if you like, who had survived tuberculosis. And she was under a famous doctor who invented a method whereby you didn't die, as you might say. So I and my brother, we lived with my grandmother, and DSJ was quite often there because he didn't really have a proper home at that time. And so he introduced me to Meccano, you know, and he showed me how to make a 2-speed and reverse Meccano gearbox, you know. So this was cool. And he would do all kinds of experiments with Meccano, doing suspension geometry for kind of independent suspensions. So he was, you know, he was this spectacular influence in all that stuff, really, you know. So it was, it was very cool.
I guess, you know, it sounds like his address was 356, because the book that I read was his account of driving all over in that car. And I mean, it's such a wonderful, I'll show a picture of that book because I think everybody should read that. He was amazing. And of course, for those of you who don't know, and I would hope if you're watching you do, but that's okay if you don't. I mean, we're talking about the co-driver, the navigator to Sterling Moss's famous number 722, 1955 Mille Miglia win.
The Mille Miglia, yep. And in fact, curiously enough, I have a photograph, which I should have thought to send you, but no matter. The picture is of a family event where a lot of our family had gone to live in America. And so a lot of my great uncles and aunts were based in America. And my American uncle, he was actually a church minister in Methuen in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And he came over for this kind of celebration, gathered everybody in the family, from little ones to old ones, with one exception, which was DSJ. Because that very weekend, Dennis was racing in the Mille Miglia, you know, and it wasn't on TV and radio and stuff, but there were ways that you could find what was going on. And I'm in this, and I'm a little lad like this, and I just want to be at home and finding out what my uncle's getting up to, you know, because he's the only one who wasn't there. The truth is, he hated that kind of thing, and probably he wouldn't want to be there anyway. And it would, because my father said, I think the Mille Miglia was an excuse to avoid the family thing.
It worked out all right.
And not many people realize that your uncle came up with the tenths formula in terms of driver's efforts, you know, 2 tenths, 6 tenths, 9 tenths. He was responsible for that.
But he also had a variation on it, which he was less keen to publicize. And that was that when you're driving down the road, and he was very good, quick road driver, you know, and you're going like 6 tenths or something, he would say, and he passes these 2 people in the car, and they flash lights and blow the horn. And he says, now those 2 are going 9.5 tenths in their little Morris. So they cannot envisage being able to go any quicker without dying. He said, now I'm going 3 tenths. Maybe I go 4 tenths to pass them, but they don't know that. So they think, obviously, I'm going to be the cause of their death, you know, and which was great. So he kind of modified this tenth thing.
Yeah, that's so great.
Yeah.
And
he taught me the Porsche Wischen business,
Yeah.
You know, to get the tail out rather than have understeer or spinning on a 356 particularly. Because every time I went to see him, he'd just loan me the Porsche and say, go out. Or he'd loan the 328 BMW that he had, you know. And he'd say,
he did more to promote Porsche as a brand with his journalism than any journalist from that era. I mean, he really went out of his way. He was a strong proponent for Porsche, the design.
Well, because, of course, he'd been part of a British group of engineers who went to Germany in 1945 to look at taking over the Volkswagen group with the Roots brothers from Roots Motor Company. And they said, oh, it's ridiculous, it's cranky, it's rubbish, it's useless. No, no, no. And he said, it's an engineering masterpiece. And they said, no, no. And they could have taken, admittedly, they'd ruined it if they'd taken VW. But he was part of that. So he kind of loved that whole technology, you know, even then.
That's so cool.
Yeah, what great story. Now there you go. I mean, we never thought we would go down that deep track of Dennis.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I did not know he was your uncle.
Yeah, yeah.
That's outstanding. So
I had no clue either. That's fascinating. I mean, that's crazy.
And Cam, I know with as much as you do around 356s and you can see the Abarth behind you. I mean, boy, that is right in your wheelhouse, isn't it? That whole driving style and everything that you're talking about.
Well, his book, Porsche 356, I think that had to be the first 5 books I ever purchased when I was in art school. So
absolutely.
Yeah. And his casual way of writing, his journalism, his stories flow. And so it captivated me.
It was like chatting to somebody. He wrote the thing called Continental Notes. And it was just like chatting to a friend because he'd come back, you know, and he'd done this and that. And it was cool. And of course, the masterpiece of the Mille Miglia as a piece. I read that again recently, you know, actually. And it was a fine bit.
Yeah, it is a fine bit.
Outstanding. Well, Peter, I mean, we've got to mention as we kind of move on into your experiences. And thank you so much for sharing that about your uncle. That's so cool.
Yeah.
You know, as your design career develops, you've covered everything from various Rovers and MGs to the Brabham Formula One cars and the Parmalat sponsorship to the Subaru Impreza WRC cars. I mean, the Lotus Esprit. I remember when I was a teenager covering the launch for a local car magazine, just sort of a way for me to get in closer to the action. The then new 1988 Lotus Esprit, which you had redesigned. And then, gosh, the Jaguar XJR 15, what an amazing race-based car. The Lamborghini Diablo Sv, the BMW V12 LMR, which, by the way, I have a model here of that.
This is great. Yes, I tell you that I mean, there's a reason all these things connect. That is, I'm fundamentally hideously competitive and also impatient. Now, if you put those two things together and you're a road car designer, having to wait 3 years to see how it would finally come out, you know, was enormously frustrating to me. If I worked on a race car, it didn't matter if it was the graphics or the aerodynamics, you know, as I used to say, in 1 minute 35, I know whether I had a good idea or not. I don't need to wait 3 years, you see, with the racing. And the very most you might wait is 24 hours if you've done something for Le Mans. You know, so to me, that was satisfying. And it also was part of my general design philosophy of not being late with the project, because they don't hold up the race because you didn't finish the car, you know. And in the road car industry, there is still a bad habit of saying, well, just give it another couple of months, you know. Well, we're not sure, you know, and all this indecision simply waters a project down. So that's why really racing intermingles with all the other stuff that I do. Yeah. And I like them to look good as well.
Well, you've certainly done that. And that brings us to perhaps the car that you're best known for, and that is the Mclaren F1. And I'm curious, when you designed that car, were you really designing a car which had no limitations on it? How did you go about approaching a car that has really no sort of family history from an appearance standpoint?
No pressure there. Yeah.
It's very true. when I went to McLaren, of course, there was their culture. Well, the culture was to spend all the money that there is available and a little bit more, you know. And Ron's thing would be you spend the money and you crunch the numbers and it comes out good, you see. But on account of which there was no kind of, when I told Ron, for example, he was saying about how wonderful Formula One cars are. And at the time I said, that surface finish of the body of a Formula One car compared with the cheapest Ford Fiesta is appalling, you know? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's all wavery and all this. And he said, well, it's meant to win races, you know? And even then I said, yeah, imagine winning races with a really fabulous looking car that's beautifully surfaced, which is part of what the BMW thing was with the 99 Le Mans car, you know? When Patrick Head said to me, we don't need a stylist. I said, no, but you do need a designer because it's got to look great. And I said, here's the deal. We'll only do anything that works better than what you've done already. And he said, well, that won't keep us busy. I said, well, just might do, you see. And in fact, I got on so nicely with the aero blokes that we did something that worked really well and looked cool as well. See, but at McLaren, there wasn't that understanding. So I came with a little group and some other friends of mine came down from Lotus as well, you know. And part of what we had to do really was an educational thing, you know, about how you would approach doing the car, you know, because I mean, we didn't think that we were doing the best car in the world. We were going to do the best car that we possibly could, you know. It was by no means an unlimited budget at all, at all. It was a tiny budget, you know. Probably, the whole thing's probably about 25 million pounds, which is what BMW would spend on the seating. You know? So it was very tight like that. But Ron was cunning because he made the money out of the other parts of the deal, like the IP of the car to BMW, so that it could be a McLaren with BMW engine, and they sort of paid for that. And then he might have just said to Mercedes, well, if you want us to stop winning with a car with BMW engine, which at the time, of course, was not terribly good, you might want to stop us selling the car by perhaps funding the 200 we don't build.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah? Might have been something like that. Who knows?
Peter, did you have a sense when you're designing the F1 that you were beyond the environment at the time? When it came to the conclusion of the project, did you have a sense you had finished something that was to become an icon in motorsports and modern automotive history? I tell you, not in the least. It was actually enormously hard work. I laughingly say that I only went grey when I worked at McLaren, but in fact, we all worked enormously hard. There was a pressure within the culture of McLaren that something should be really good. That's for sure, you know. And the concentration, but also, and it probably sounds cynical to say, but for example, with the aerodynamics, I knew that we would have very wealthy customers who weren't necessarily the best drivers in the world. And our job was to look after them as well as we could, you know, which meant the car had to be fundamentally stable. And it was the same with my friend Steve Randall, who did the suspension work, that it had to be very communicative so it didn't get you into trouble, you know. And the same Mark Masters, who did the braking and things, we knew that we wanted it to stop better than anything else, because very early on, we were discussing this, that little group of us, and we said, well, if you're on the Autobahn and you're going 200 miles an hour and a truck pulls out half a kilometer ahead of you and it's going like 30 or 40, you will hit it. You know, and that's just physics. You will hit it, you know, if you just go like this. So you've got to be able to get out of the way as well. And we did actually have that in mind, you know, that we had a responsibility to look after the people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which I think pretty much we did. Yeah. I have to say this is backstepping a little bit, but one of the reasons I'm a car guy is in the late 90s when I was in college, my friends and I would stay up to 2 a.m. watching on a television program called Speed Vision. That dates us, Ray.
Oh, yeah.
And we would watch the WRC, and I saw the Subaru race teams, and I don't think there's a guy not in his 40s who doesn't like, I was mesmerized. The P1 program, I said one day I'm going to own a Subaru.
I still do. But in fact, I own a Subaru road car that I designed for them back in the last century. We can say that now. You see,
That's great.
in fact, it was like in 1998. It's a Legacy Outback with the flat six, which was a joint venture between Porsche and Subaru.
Oh my gosh!
And it is just a glorious engine in there. It's really, really cool, actually, and I still love it.
Yeah.
It's actually, it was a car design that I could afford, which is also got to be good. But the Subaru thing was great because that was it was very different from, for example, when I was at Lotus, we worked with Toyota for the gearbox with the XL, and then with engine and driveline with Isuzu, and those were pretty tight, kind of stiff, organized Japanese companies, and all these guys would come in all the gray outfits, and they'd sit along a table about a kilometer long, and we'd sit opposite them. But with Subaru, they were like a bunch of pirates, and the way the company was organized, there were guys called the father of Impreza and the father of Legacy, and these guys knew everything about that product line.
Really?
Fuji-san, who was the father of Impreza, and he would, because we did all the modeling not far from where I live here in Suffolk, and Fuji would come over with 3 other guys, and they could make all the decisions,
Wow.
And it was just great. And I would show them what we're doing, and they'd say, oh, remember, for our production method, you have to have maybe a 2 mil radius along here. We can't be sharper than this, you see. And I said, yeah, okay, because we had the full-size clay model. We do this. Yeah, perfect. That's fine. Okay, next thing. The air outlet we want, especially on the rally car. Oh, that's good. Yeah. And it was so easy, and it was such good fun, and they just loved to go to the pub in the evening. And when we went to Japan, it was the same. It was just, there were just 3 of us went over from ProDrive, and it was thoroughly good fun, actually. I'd like them, which is why the Subaru I've got came from them not many years ago, because I've still got friends there. Yeah. They probably don't enjoy the Toyota experience quite as much.
Sorry about that, Ray, but I had to get that Subaru story in there. I love it. That's amazing.
Well, it's good. Well, the guy who ran the racing was a fellow with black patch over one eye, and at the meetings he would always have a couple of beers and a cigarette going, which I imagine wasn't absolutely accepted for. And the funny bit was, his name was Sakurai. Sakurai in Japan is a cherry. And my guy who came with me from ProDrive in UK was Roland Cherry. And so these two would spend a whole evening laughing about having the same name while they were downing beers. So it was a different relationship from a lot of them, but it was good. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Well, Cam, you did say, we were going to go down deep tracks, and I mean, I'm sure these stories aren't anywhere else. So it's
well, they're not really. They're not. But I should, I should leap back to the Porsche thing, seeing as I can see Porsche right there on your shirt, because with Richard Lloyd, we got into VW Golf because he bought a VW Golf, and then he drove around to my house and he said, I think this would make a good race car. What do you think? And we went down some roads out in the countryside near us, and we thought, well, we'll enter the British Touring Car Championship. And at that stage, there was just he and I, and we went to a local VW dealer and said, can we have a corner of your workshop and borrow a guy to come with us, and change the wheels and stuff. And we literally started the championship with the 3 of us. In amongst that, we won the Danish Grand Prix in a VW Golf, which was just Richard and I.
That's amazing, because we talked with John a little bit, obviously, about Richard Lloyd, and we know him as a Porsche privateer racer, and who did a lot of engineering around the car. But I really, again, I'm learning so much. I didn't realize that you were actually one of the founding fathers, basically, there of GTI engineering, and where the name came from. And of course, then eventually the switch to Porsche when the 924 Carrera GTR came along, and the sponsorship from Canon. That led to some work that you were involved in. So you actually did working with the team is just as much as designing the look of the race cars.
Oh, yeah, I did. I mean, because what I did quite a lot of, I did sponsorship proposals for people, and I would draw the car and how the graphics would look. I worked for a guy called Guy Edwards, who was a master of sponsorship deals, and yeah, I would do the drawings for him of how, like that Tic Tac sponsored 956 and things like this, and the J. David ones. I mean, all of these things. Yes, so I did the first of all, we didn't have a sponsor with the Porsche, with the VW GTI, So I just did huge graphic on the side saying Golf GTI, and VW took it up and said, playing golf at the weekend means you might need to wear a helmet, you see, which was neat. And at which point they had not asked us about that, you see. And we said, well, why don't you sponsor us, and supply us the cars, and then we'll go and find the big sponsor, which was Canon, and we took Canon with us from the 924 onto the 956, via the 924 was good because when you were a customer, then you just kind of got both times when Richard bought the 956, he and Jonathan Palmer and I went across to Zuffenhausen, and we were partly with Richard because he had a briefcase with him with the cash to buy the car.
This is awesome.
And then they said, oh, okay, Mr. Lloyd, yeah, your car's downstairs. Here's a handbook. Here's the paperwork. Here's the key. And we went down to the basement of Zuffenhausen, and there's this white 956 sitting there, and it's got gas in it, and it's charged up, So we kind of drove it outside, and then while they probably went off and had lunch, I took some red Fablon material to do the red stuff, and I'd cut out Canon lettering by hand and just stuck it on so we could do a picture there in the yard of the thing looking vaguely like Canon Porsche, And I mean, interesting, they gave us the key because at first, nothing more dangerous than having a key in a race car, because it even had keys for the locks on the doors, which is kind of what you don't want, actually. And the first job we did was obviously to get rid of those. And we then discovered that the car came with a long tail, and the first race was Monza, which you definitely want a short tail for. But then they said, oh, yeah, well, that's, however much it was, 10,000 Deutschmarks. Oh, that's extra. So, yeah, at which point we thought, oh, this could get more expensive than we planned with the bits. But even with the little 924, it was the same. And I took it to the wind tunnel because it had some funny old things with it, I would have to say. And it had a weird cooling system with its own radiator for the cylinder head and a separate radiator for the block and a steel plate and no interconnection between the two. And of course, they would heat to different temperatures and you'd get gaskets problems and all the rest. Yeah. So we did a system with both and a different radiator and plumbed it in and all the rest of it. And then that was the first year we went to Le Mans. You have time for a quick Le Mans story?
Oh, of course. Yeah, well, please.
First year, we took this 924 to Le Mans and we didn't have a clue. I mean, we really didn't have a clue, We didn't know that you needed a signal crew at the time out at the Mulsanne corner because you couldn't signal the car from the pit lane because you weren't allowed to walk across and hang over the wall, So we had to buy some walkie-talkie and strapped them to the roll cage inside so we could tell the guys what the lap speeds were. But we qualified 56 and only 55 cars started, you know. So we thought, oh, God, we've got to go home. But interestingly, the guy who at the time ran all of Le Mans, he was a nice, some people didn't like him, he was a nice fellow. And he came up to me because I was looking vaguely like the team manager. And he said, Peter, don't pack the car. And I said, yeah, but we didn't qualify. He said, listen to me, don't pack up the car. At 2:45, be ready at the entrance to the pit lane from the paddock and have your guys ready. And I said, what do you mean? He said, just be quiet and do what I tell you. Well, that was the year when the Andretti's car was pushed off Lola was pushed off because they refused to change the position of the oil coolers, which was hanging out the back of the car. And any slight rear end, you know, would have sprayed oil everywhere. And so there was this great kerfuffle, and we could hear this noise, and suddenly the gates open, you know, and then they are saying, come on, come on. So we take up our 55th place on the grid, and the, you know, uproar, and we had to take over the Andretti pit, and the guys wouldn't leave the pit, you see. And at the time, a pit was an empty space, and you went to Leroy Merlin, the hardware store, and you bought all this wood and you built yourself the inside of the pit. And so then they said, well, we want 50,000 francs. You know? And we said, no, take the stuff away. Oh, we can't take it away. They said, well, we don't want it. We'll just, you know, bring a camping table. And there was this great argument about having to pay for this stuff. You know? But anyway, we started the race, you know, and it ran really nicely, and it was very competitive with the works ones. But what happened was 2:45, a bolt dropped out of the prop shaft, you know. Now we'd got a box of bolts in there because we thought, well, bolts might be useful. But it was Andy Rouse who was driving it at the time, you see, and the radio wouldn't work because we only had this dumb radio like this. So he climbed up the banking near Mulsanne Corner, whereupon a marshal says, oh, you've walked more than 10 meters from the car, it's out. You know, by which time he said, hey, I'm sorry, guys, the car's out. So I went to the race organizers and I said, we have to withdraw the car. And the same guy he said, no, Peter, go away. You haven't withdrawn the car. You're withdrawing the car at 10 past midnight, not 10 before. That way you get all the starting money.
Wow. How about that?
And he said, because I just love the attitude of your team. It's just terrific, you know? It's absolutely great. And so I went back at 10 past and I said, oh, I'm sorry, we're withdrawing. And he said, oh, lucky it's after midnight. You get the money. So that was very cool, actually. That was definitely a delight, you know? And that car was good. I mean, we did a lot of development work. The time we came to do the Daytona 24 hours, you know. In fact,
I just love these stories, authentic stories of passion. I don't know if that would happen. You know, these are different times, but
oh boy, they wouldn't happen. Yeah, I know.
I just love
absolutely. But because I mean, we like doing it, you know. And from that first time, I realized, well, two things. One, first thing, I wrote myself a note for the following year saying, whatever you do, don't go back to Le Mans. You know, open this at Easter. And I said, nah. But also I realized that it's their race and you have to be charming. And you send them a nice picture of the team with the car and thank you on it. And the drivers sign it and you send it across there, you know, and they're delighted because it's, you know, it's not arrogant. And I mean, I carried on doing that all the way through the various projects at Le Mans, you know.
Well, I suppose on that note, we should probably congratulate you on the 25th anniversary then of the Le Mans win of your McLaren F1.
Well, that's true. It's true, although it was galling, to be honest. And I know it's easy. Funny, I was only talking to Derek Bell a couple of days ago, and he still knows that we should have won with the Harrods McLaren F1, you know. And it was the reason was, and the reason that that car survived was because it didn't have the new clutch and clutch withdrawal mechanism that everybody else was told to use. And McLaren didn't take any spares of the original one. And the way it worked, you didn't take McLaren spares, they supplied you. And we all knew, with the exception of the Ueno Clinic car, that it wasn't going to survive the race, you know, because the clutch release mechanism was pretty silly. It was two little roller bearings that effectively were used in compression, which you never use a bearing in compression, you know. And they were supposed to work, they came from, meant to be in a gearbox in an oil bath situation, not in a cloud of carbon dust. So they seized and cracked. We all knew this was going to happen, you know. And with ours, Andy Wallace had to drive the last 3 sessions without the clutch, including at the pit stops, dropping it off the jacks as he got the clutch and throttle just right, you know.
Yeah.
Which was, which was a shame, actually, you know, because Andy was just terrific and Derek was great, actually. And it was a hideous wet night, you know. It was absolutely, and the wipers weren't terribly good and you had to be quite brave. I mean, the interesting bit was Derek's son, Justin, drove the car, and Derek still tells me the most stressful, frightening thing ever in his life was being glued to the TV set in the pit, watching Justin out there in this hideous rain in the dark.
Yeah.
You know? And he said, that was my lad. And I just thought, I should be out there, you know. Oh dear. Oh, and he couldn't tear himself away, you know, from watching this, actually. And to not be too unfair to Justin, he wasn't, you know, he wasn't used to the car, you know.
Yeah.
And it was, it was pretty horrible. You know?
Wow. Well, that's 25 years ago. And
it is. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary, Wild, isn't it?
25 years ago, yeah. And 25 years before that, well, of course, Porsche achieved their first ever overall win at Le Mans 1970.
Yeah.
And you've been sent along some beautiful imagery, sort of walking through the design of the 917 that Porsche used to win.
Yes.
And I'd really like to talk about some of the differences, because in the illustrations that you provided, you really sort of walk us through that, because there are many variations of the 917, including one that never really saw the light of day. And there's an interesting story behind that.
Well, there is. I mean, I was interested because my great friend from college and then at Ford together, then he went to Porsche and I saw him quite often when I was there. And he would tell me, I mean, he told me all the 917 stories, which were that, for example, the wheels were lifed and they're very short life for the wheels, particularly rear wheels. And they used to be just thrown in the Schrott, which was just a recycling huge tip. But you could take a wheel out and there was a local guy would cut you a glass disc of 1/4-inch thick plate glass, and everybody had a 917 rear wheel coffee table. And if you were smart, you could have a 917 flywheel and crankshaft. Wow. And you could thread a wire and put a light at the top of it. And then you would have this sitting room light, which if your wife was really long suffering, which was a 917 crank. And so, I mean, there was a lovely atmosphere like that. And Dawson used to keep me pretty much informed about it, you know. And the illustrations actually came from, partly they were from a story I did for an English magazine called Road Rat. But then I also did a lecture down at the Revs Institute for Miles Collier about the 917 as well, because I came across the original wind tunnel work sheets of the first 917, you know, and with the glorious ease of hindsight, you know, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, no wonder they got in a muddle. They were chasing the wrong thing, because Piech had simply given them a figure that he wanted for the CD. Mm-hmm. And lift and balance were not included at all. But in amongst it, they changed 4 things at once. Now, when I go to the wind tunnel, I'm disciplined. You only change one thing and you write down exactly what you've changed and what you've kept the same. And they've changed 4 things, at which point, how do you know what worked? So I was reading through this thinking, oh dear, you know, this is not going to come out well, if you like, you know, which with the first one, of course, it didn't really, you know. And then there was a lot of difference of opinion about whether John Wyer did the short tail first, or actually there were some people at Porsche that said, oh no, we'd drawn that years before. But actually, when you look at the drawing and the date, it's kind of not the case. I mean, in a way, it's always the thing, if a car ends up really successful, everybody puts their hand up and says, hey, yeah, that's my bit, you know, because that's just how it is, you know. That's what my friend Dawson said when he first went to Porsche. And he said, so who designed the 911, you know? And all these guys go, oh, it's me. No, me. And he said, well, who did the 914? Oh, he did. He did, you see, which was a shame. And that's just kind of how that stuff happens, I think, really. But yeah, the Pierre, I mean, he was spending, you know, like unbelievable amounts on this 917 program. And he wanted as broad an input of different, you know, thoughts on it as possible. So he went to a number of different aerodynamic and design groups, but he also went to the Porsche design studio, where they had a very good aerodynamicist in the studio called, I think, Hans Brunn. And they decided that although top speed was important, that it shouldn't lift at all, which was quite unusual at that time to be as concerned. But because on the road cars, they were concerned with lift, you know, to a degree. So they went and did a lot of wind tunnel work, you know, with the car. And it was a radical looking thing. Now, in competition with that project was what became later known as the Pink Pig, you know.
1720.
Yeah, and the studio one was also based on 1720 as well. So that was going to be, and there was going to be all these different cars because there were also the long tail ones as well, were done by yet another aerodynamic group, you know. But I think somebody then must have knocked on Pierre's door and said, hey, this is not realistic, the rate at which you guys are spending money, you know, so we really have to cut one of the programs, you know. And so they said, they called Tony Lapine to head office, and Pierre was going to tell him, I'm sorry, you're losing the design one, you know. And the designers got together with Lapine and they said, okay, here's the deal. You get Pierre to sign a document saying, okay, we'll give up on the design of the Studio 91720, but we want responsibility for all the graphics of all the cars.
Wow.
Which was kind of neat. And so and there's a photograph of when they came out of the meeting, and they're coming out grinning, rubbing their hands because they got the signed deal. Whereupon they did the Truffle Hound pig with all the cuts and Pierre, of course, was you know, almost unspeaking in his rage about this, but nothing he could do because there was the signed document. But it was actually the same with the hippie one, because they did have an extremely relaxed evening where they sat around and kind of smoked a bit and thought, how can this be? You know, and they came up with that as well. And you know, he knew the circumstances under which that had been done as well. But there was nothing could be done, you know, which was kind of fun. But it did mean that they also then did, like the fabulous Porsche Austria 917 that won at Le Mans, you know, and the Martini ones and all the others, which is how Dawson then came to do the 9083s for Targa Florio as well. Yeah. So it was, there was an interesting outcome to that. But of course, the 9720, the Pink Pig, it probably didn't cool the brakes enough, you know, but it's not something you would have said at the time because it wouldn't sound too. The sad thing was that, and it's one of the things with aerodynamics, you can easily lower the drag coefficient by increasing the frontal area. But the magic thing is you end up with the same drag, because I did a research project while I was at Lotus where we made a shape which we could widen, lengthen, raise, lower, bend in, bend out, you know. And it's funny, there was a fundamental thing that a car tended to have a certain drag coefficient, and you could tweak it a little bit, but fundamentally that's what you got. And if you chased one thing, you lost another, you know, which of course was the original 917 problem. You know, you chased it and lost it. So it was, but of course we did the same thing with our 956 and 962s together with Nigel Stroud, who did the honeycomb chassis. You know, we did a lot of work, both with a scale model and full size at the Myra Wind Tunnel. In fact, the scale model is interesting. A guy contacted me a couple of years ago from California who had found and bought this model of a 956, but of our Richard Lloyd 956. And he'd found inside it a little sticker from Dove Company, who are the friends of mine who made the GLP of the model. And through them, he tracked me down to see if it was for real. And it was our wind tunnel model, which it was, you know, wow. Which is great.
I mean, the stories of that, I mean, the liquid moly car that's sitting behind you, of course, the Canon cars, those were, you know, kind of relating these stories of Porsche's most iconic liveries. Those were some of the most iconic liveries of the 80s, obviously.
Yeah.
The 962 programs.
Yeah, the Canon ones were good. And the Canon, it was a nice, I mean, the whole point with sponsorship really is that you only got a few seconds to get the message across, you know, like this, you know, and something overly complicated, but also something, I always think, something that destroys the shape of the car. It makes it hard to talk to Porsche about the fact that you're a great customer, you know, with them when you've made the thing look I mean, there was a couple of Mclaren F1 color schemes, which were just awful, monstrous things. And I did some work with Benetton after they had made what I called fairground rides. They would just, you know, they put every colored sticker and bit and piece on the thing because they just wanted the money, you know. And later when David Richards briefly ran Benetton, I tried to get back control of the message we were giving people, because I think that's important, you know, and that's with a lot of these, what I was trying to do. I mean, over my shoulder, I'm just going to swing around, is this Norris Ring car. Do you guys have access to that poster yourselves at all?
No, I do not.
Well, because am I going to be able to do this without, when you look at the front,
yeah,
there's a little extra piece on the front, because at the Norris Ring particularly, it's quite a slow track there, and two very tight hairpin turns in it. When turn in and front downforce is essential, you know, and the turn in on ours was like all the other Porsches, you know, and I think particularly it was Mauro Baldi said, I want to get more bite when I turn in, you know. Mm-hmm. And overnight, I took a little mold off the front edge of the nose, so it was hairy side out glass fiber. When it went off, I moved it forward and we riveted it and bonded it back on to give it this extra bit of nose, you know, which transformed the turn-in of the car. I mean, the car was just phenomenal there. Yeah. You know, it was absolutely, Derek Bell he said, I don't know, you know, I don't know about that car. It's just quicker than all of us, you know, which is why we won the event there, you know, against all those smart people. So we were constantly fiddling like that with the cars. And we did a two-piece rear wing, and at Brands Hatch, we did this little wing over the nose, you know, which, I mean, all of that, we were terrible fiddlers. I mean, it was the same with our McLaren F1. Yeah. So I think it's, you know, it's something that I do. And Richard was really supportive in all of that work, you know. I mean, there's just a little quick tale. When second year we took the 924 to Le Mans, And we took it to scrutineering, and everybody gathers round to look at the other cars, you see. And we roll it into scrutineering. And Jürgen Barth, who is a great mate of mine now, and he came up to me and he said, Peter, that's not going to work. You can't run the car that low. You just cannot run the car that low. And I said, why is that, you see? And as I say, why is that? It's going up on the lip, like this, you see. And he said, because you wrecked the rear drive shafts. Now, the rear drive shaft on those 924s had 2 universal joints and a third one in the middle. And they cost a fortune. And even with those, if you tried to lower the car, all the angles got wrong, you see. And so Jürgen went underneath and he said, you bastard, you've moved the gearbox. I said, well, yeah, because we wanted to keep the drive shafts horizontal. He said, but you've moved it up. I said, yeah, but you've altered the angle of the engine because it was on a straight line. Yeah. He said, we never thought of that. Which was just great, you know, and it just seemed kind of a logical thing. Probably part of that came from knowing and working with Tom Walkinshaw, who would always be looking for another route, you know, to beat the opposition, you know. But that's the whole, you know, that's what we thought was the game. You know?
That's fabulous. I mean, GTI engineering. You look at the 962 by the late 1980s. I mean, the car, you had developed almost the entire body. Other than the canopy, it appeared to be different from what the 962 was, and you were working hard to keep it competitive at that point.
Well, absolutely, because throughout this whole story, of course, and recently I talked with, who are now old mates, who worked with Jost, you know, and we were having an evening out in Germany 3 or 4 years ago, and they said, we don't know what went on. They said, because we always had the next better engine than you guys had. And then you were chasing us and you were passing us, you know. And I said, well, because we knew that when we had a 2.6, they had a 2.8. When we got our 2.8, they had a 3 liter, then they had the 3.2. And we were always behind, you know. And we would have a Bosch Motronic slightly less than theirs, you know, which was one of the reason we came second at Le Mans, only very close behind the Yosts. And I said to them, well, because we fiddled with everything, every bit of geometry, you know, particularly the front bulkhead, which on a 956, when you really bang the pedals, which is what Jan Lammers used to do, the bulkhead would bend a bit. And Jan said, if you can make that stiff, oh, he didn't bend a lot, but just enough, because what he discovered with downforce cars was at top speed, it was impossible to hit the pedal so hard that you'd lock the brakes, which is the thing in Formula One. And he realized then you had to slowly come off the brake as you lost speed because you lost the downforce effect. And if you modulated it just right, you could outbrake everybody, you know. He said, but I need a really stiff bulkhead at the front, which is what we discovered that at Monza, which was the first race. So yeah, within days we were fiddling with that, you know.
Gosh,
what a story! Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating stories. Well, you know, this has just been an incredible, fascinating conversation, and without a doubt, we could go on and on and on. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah.
So much.
I have one last question, Ray, before we sign. Peter, you've had such a storied career. That's the envy of anybody that's an automotive enthusiast. Can you share with us probably what is the most important thing you've learned during your career, if you could synthesize one lesson?
Great question.
It's with road cars and it's with race cars, and you have got to exude enthusiasm and confidence for what you do.
Yes.
Now, a perfect example in race cars is that when we went with the BMW 1999 to Le Mans, 3 times a Mercedes took off. 3 times they were extreme. Twice was Mark Webber, you know. And the other time was Peter Dumbreck, and he was very lucky. And your drivers say to you, could that happen to our car? You know? And you have, first of all, you have to believe that you have tested for that, you know, and you understand what the aerodynamics, or any other part of it is doing. So you can put your hand on your heart and say, we've looked at that and our car's right, and you have to believe in yourself that you've done it, because you don't say, nah, it's fine when you know it's not, which would just be hideous. So you have to exude that. And then the driver, there's, oh, that's okay then. I mean, it happened with the McLaren F1 when it was Andy Wallace went to the VW test track, with the McLaren F1. By that time I had left McLaren, but Andy phoned me up and he said, look, I'm going quite quick there, he said, and over 200, the car's kind of moving about on the straight bits and it's not comfortable, and he said, nobody knows what to do. And I said, well, what are the ride heights, and what you got the springs and what are you doing with the dampers, and they had it, they didn't have the car right, really. I said, well, lower this a bit, change that, particularly, stiffen the bump on the rear dampers so it won't, sit down too much. And he said, oh, that'll be all right then. And I said, yeah, that'll be okay then. See? And he said, all right, I'll phone you later, you see. And I put the phone down and I thought, because Andy's one of my best buddies in the world, and I thought, I've just told one of my best mates that because of what I've said over the phone, he's going to be all right to go 240 miles an hour. Well, that is really quite a mature moment in your life, like it was with Le Mans as well, And at the same time, the first truck I designed, which was for a company called Foden, and the boss was Peter Foden, and we showed him the full-size prototype, and he said, so you think this will be good? And I said, yeah, no, it'll be good. It'll sell. And he said, and at the time, it sounded to me a lot. He said, so if I spend my 40 million quid on this, you're telling me people will buy it? And I said, yeah, absolutely, because it's so much better than the old one, But not because you're bullshitting, but because you believe you've done a good enough job, that it will be, And that's a degree, of kind of confidence because you know what you're doing, and then the ability to transmit that to people, that it'll be okay.
That's a great life lesson. Thank you for sharing that.
It's good. It's fun.
That is. Well, on that note, why don't we wrap it up for our friends at home so that they can finish up at a decent time. But boy, Peter, what a wonderful conversation again. Thank you so much for this. I imagine folks who want to can read more about you and even reach out to you on your website.
Yeah, they can. Absolutely. Or I do a thing on Instagram, Peter Stevens Design, and on Facebook. I mean, I've been entertaining people during this lockdown business, particularly in the UK. As you can see, we still don't have hairdressers who are open. So it's kind of, I know you don't have that problem. Although maybe you're like a friend who used to shave his head and one day he changed his mind and he discovered he was bald.
That's good.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Cam, thank you for being here with us again today and doing this with me. It's such a wonderful invitation you extended, and I really appreciate that opportunity to be here on Fresh Brewed and Air-Cooled Deep Tracks. So for all of you, keep driving, enjoying, and sharing your classic Porsche passion. So from everyone at Porsche Classic, I say so long for now. Cam?
Peter Stevens, what an honor today. This has been terrific. And from everyone from the Road Scholars team, thank you everyone for tuning in.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure, and I hope it's a pleasure for people to listen to.
Let's do it again. Let's do it again.
We
Cheers.
should think about that. Yeah, we should.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you. Indeed. Okay. Bye then.